Hello boys and girls, and welcome back to my channel. This episode is in direct response to a comment in the previous episode in which we examined the name that we call this communal settlement, a kibbutz. What's in a name? Is the name still relevant? Well, first of all, let me tell you that, and remind you that the kibbutz is a family. And like any family anywhere else in the world, there are different people in the family, different ages, different attitudes, different thoughts, different types of behavior. And I promised you from the beginning of this channel that there will be no sugar coating. There are members who keep to the rules and those who do not keep to the rules. Let's remember that the ideology of the founding fathers of kibbutz, the pioneers, did not oblige the second, third and fourth generation to follow the rules. They were born into this society. When did any kids in any family anywhere else in the world accept 100% what their parents believed in or what their parents told them to do? Add on to that the second and third and fourth generation that intermarried and brought in people from the outside who basically had no commitment or understanding what kibbutz was really about. So let's look at kibbutz as a family which originally had an ideology, and whether that communal ideology was renewable or sustainable by the second, third and fourth generations. There are certain philosophers in kibbutzim who say that the idea of communality, kibbutz as a concept, goes against human nature. The human nature of self-preservation, self-identity and individuality. First and foremost, we take care of ourselves. The idea of sharing everything with others in a group, they say, is unnatural. However, as individuals, we are also social animals. We do not live by ourselves, although we act many times individually. We start as a member of a family. Those families become extended families. Those extended families become clans. And the clan system then develops into a tribe. Somebody else also mentioned this in the previous episode, the comparison between tribalism in South America and the kibbutz. The larger the group, the kibbutz, or if you want to call it the tribe, gets, the more diverse the individual behavior is within that framework. In a third and fourth generation kibbutz, as I just mentioned, there are members who came in as spouses of kibbutz-born children, adults. These people came from towns with different levels of experience, of individuality, of looking after themselves, of making a career, making money, property, and all different types of things. As I just said, this episode is in direct response to a comment made in the previous episode. Brian Ratner of the UK asked two very pertinent questions. He asked, how and why did the kibbutzim become so indebted to the banks in the 1980s and in the 1990s? And were the banks the only reason for the kibbutzim being forced to change and reform? Well, thank you, Brian, very, very much for asking these two questions, because it lies at the heart and soul of what happened in the following years after the financial crisis. He asked whether the banks were the cause or the catalyst of the change. And in short, with no messing around and no sugarcoating and no fibbing or trying to cover up or anything else, I will say directly, no, the banks were not the cause. It's a matter of what happened inside of kibbutzim, and you can even call it the fading and then the collapse or the non-durability of the ideology of the original system. But before we look at examples, just a few examples which are going to be really the tip of the iceberg concerning the dilution and loss or downfall, or whichever way you want to put it, of kibbutz ideology in the second, third and fourth generation. Let's just mention the economic side, because kibbutzim were not acting with their businesses and their finances in isolation from the rest of the country. In the 1980s, there were terrible economic conditions nationally. As I mentioned previously as well, that we had reached the stage in the early or mid-1980s of 400% inflation. This was absolutely disastrous. Then add on to that the fact that the kibbutzim had lost their political and economic support when the Labour government went out of power and Menachem Begin came into power in 1977. So we had, in stages, from the end of the 1970s going into the 1980s, subsidies and financial support was withdrawn from the kibbutzim. They literally had the carpet whipped from under their feet. Till then, the Labour government, until 1977, had done everything possible to support the kibbutzim. This included placing kibbutz members in positions of power nationally, such as the head of the National Trades Union, the Histadrut. And from my kibbutz in the 1970s, we had a veteran member, a founder member of my kibbutz, Yitzchak Ben Aharon, who became head of the Histadrut National Trade Union. I say for me, in a way, he was, because of his power, but real power nationally, he was very much like Jimmy Hoffa without the criminality. From the early days of kibbutzim, from the pioneering times and then continuing after that into the 60s and the 70s, kibbutzniks played a major role in the development and the existence of the State of Israel. Golda Meir was Prime Minister. She originally was from Kibbutz Merchavia. Levi Eshkol and Kaddish Luz. Levi Eshkol, the Prime Minister, Kaddish Luz, Speaker of the Knesset, both from the Ganya Bet. In the army as well, Dan Shomron, Chief of Staff from Ashdod Yaakov. Ehud Barak, who later became Chief of Staff and then went on to be Prime Minister, was born in Kibbutz Mishmar HaSharon. Kibbutzniks were all over the place and were either leading or grew into leadership positions, and they had emanated from kibbutzim. But on a lower level, with no international fame or even national fame, other kibbutzniks, backed by the Labour Party, were favoured over other citizens in towns on many occasions for specific jobs. I would even say jobs for the boys. This caused great resentment in towns. Once the right-wing government after 1977 came to power, there was a lot of resentment that came to the surface, and people in the towns started to take their revenge and look at how kibbutzim had enjoyed social, financial, and economic privilege over those people in town. Labor cronyism had stymied the advance of many of the people in Israeli cities till then, something that perhaps people outside of Israel didn't know about. But now I'm telling you, that's the way it was. But I can say quite honestly that it wasn't only a matter of right-wing policies withdrawing support of the kibbutzim after 1977. It was a matter of internally the kibbutzim were losing their values. The mixed successive generations of members had led to some form of ideological dilution. Yes, the values of the kibbutzim appeared to many, and to others they didn't appear, even in the 1960s and the 1970s, and came to fruition in the 1980s and the 1990s. I said there in the last episode, quite lightly or even glibly, that some members weren't pulling their weight. Well, it was a hell of a lot more than that. I really didn't want to go into it at that stage in the last episode, and now I will be giving you a few examples which, as I said just before, are only the tip of the iceberg with regards to the way members were, in a way, let's call it, living off the fat of the land. I mean, there are many who earned that position, don't get me wrong, but there were others who were exploiting the kibbutz system by being provided with so much and yet ignoring the values and the true behavior of what was required of their kibbutz members. So it's not only now in 2023, or even in 2010, or even in the year 2000 when kibbutzim started to make the Reformation, that we ask that question, is a kibbutz really a kibbutz? I could very, very frankly say to you, we could have asked that question if we recognized it and admitted it to ourselves in the 1970s and the 1980s. But people were not aware of it. And it was only by the pressure of the right-wing government and then subsequently the banks that we were forced to look at our own behavior and see where we went wrong, and perhaps to search under a lot of pressure for a solution to reform the behavior of kibbutzniks themselves, and in a way to look for new sources of income and to look at the way we regarded work and everything else, and then eventually repay the banks. So the banks were not the reason that we made the change. They were the catalyst. Of course, the government behind the banks were the real people who were pushing the banks to become the catalyst for change. In the previous episode, I mentioned the humorous story that my late friend David Wicker used to tell about him going down to the factory, finding two guys who were sitting around lazily doing nothing, and he asked them what they were doing, and they both of them replied, "We're doing nothing." He went to the factory management and he said, "You've got to fire some people and downsize your factory." The factory manager said, "Well, you know, why do I have to downsize?" So David told me, you know, he found 2 people who were doing nothing, and that was the reply he gave to the manager. That was a humorous story which mirrored the reality of kibbutzim. Over the years, both internally within kibbutz service industry and in economic branches such as a factory or anything else, there was overstaffing of positions. I'll give you one example of overstaffing. I myself, in the 1980s, I worked full-time and then part-time in the kibbutz laundry. The kibbutz laundry was supplying laundry service for the whole kibbutz, which was then about 300 or 400 members. And we had a laundry staff of about 4 or 5 people working there full-time. And I was working there. And I looked at it, I thought, this is crazy, because if I just carry on working normally, this is a place for 2 or 3 people to work. There's overstaffing here, there's other overstaffing in the clothes storeroom where people were ironing and folding and placing the clean laundry back in members' boxes. All over the kibbutz, there was overstaffing in the dining room as well. Apart from overstaffing in the services such as the dining room or the laundry or the clothes store or different things like that, there was even overstaffing, particularly in managerial positions in kibbutz factories. And this was because one of the factors was jobs for the boys. The other side of it was there was inefficient management in many of the kibbutz factories. How did all this happen? Well, let's examine and unravel why the kibbutzim imploded in this sense. The internal ideological downfall impacted well before the outside pressures. Let's look at kibbutzim objectively with a different perspective, and remember one thing, that kibbutzim were and still are small villages, but as their businesses, as their factories and everything else developed and expanded, there were, relatively speaking, to the growing number of business positions, fewer people who were capable or professional enough to manage these branches. In other words, the kibbutzim had a limited number of human resources to manage growing businesses, and they were against outsourcing because it was a matter of, again, try and make the best of a situation with your own internal management, human resources. Don't give it to people on the outside who are professionals. Now, again, I don't want you to get me wrong. There's a balance here. There were many very good and capable people who were professionally qualified by experience and by studies to run certain branches of the kibbutzim, including the factories. But the business was growing and they couldn't keep pace internally with their own resources to fulfill management positions. At one stage in my life, I was looking around for a job to do. For one reason or another, I'm not going to go into it because this is a personal story And it goes very, very deeply, even to the heart of the way I saw the kibbutzim then in the 80s and 90s, and why I was one of a group of people who decided that we had to make the change. So I was looking for a job. I went down to the factory because I was invited there to fill a position. I looked around. I said to the manager who offered me the job, I said quite honestly, well, maybe I don't want to blow my own trumpet here. Let's say this isn't the job for me. I'm capable of doing a lot more. So as I was going out to the factory, somebody in the office saw me. I found out later what had happened. That person reported back to the factory manager and said, well, Ivry is looking for a job and we need a quality manager, because the previous quality manager had just resigned after 2 years. Well, what happened was the person who saw me talked to the factory manager, and the end of it was that I was offered the job as quality assurance manager, and they knew nothing about me. There was no formal interview to find out what my background was. I took the job because, as it worked out, I had been running a translation business. My translation service had involved translating from Hebrew to English quality assurance manuals. So I had a certain background about what quality assurance procedures were and the demands of the Israel Quality Institute with regards to international standards. So I had an idea of what quality assurance was about. But I was offered the job with absolutely no interview procedure. I got the job, and I learned the job on the job, and I did a course as well of the Israel Productivity Institute, and I was quality manager in this traditional style industry for 9 years later after that, because of certain personal attributes. I was headhunted and became quality manager of a high-tech firm. So that example of myself as becoming quality manager in a traditional industry in my own kibbutz is just one example of hundreds throughout the kibbutzim, whereby people were given positions of power, responsibility, which needed professionalism, and yet they were running the show. I can think of many more. I mean, I can even think in my own kibbutz of the financial and economic management positions. I remember over the years, early on, in the 80s, 90s, of two financial managers of the kibbutz who quite honestly were incapable of running the show. I won't mention any names. I mean, these are just a very, very small examples of what was going on in the 80s and 90s. On the one hand, we had incapable, non-professional, and I'm not talking about my kibbutz, I'm talking about many kibbutzim with a lack of manpower that brought their own members in to manage professional positions and didn't know what the hell they were doing. Again, don't get me wrong, there were some very, very good people, but these very, very good people became attrition by the fact that so much pressure was put on them that it was soul destroying for them. They were good professional people, well-intentioned people, and more pressure was put on them to run the show alongside with others who were incapable. So there was a complete collapse in my books of professional managerial running of the show. That's the way it was. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm going to get a ton of bricks coming down on me if people of my kibbutz find out what I've just told you, the viewers. But quite honestly, as what was his name in Gone with the Wind said, well, quite frankly, I don't give a damn. That's the way it is. Because we were talking about a period of time where there was internal, ideological, moral, financial, managerial collapse of the kibbutzim that lasted over a period, varies between different kibbutzim, lasted over a period of about 20 years or so, which no longer exists. And thank goodness we made the change, the reformation, or if some people want to call it privatization, because kibbutzim today do not have the inefficient management and the overstaffing of positions that existed then 30 odd years ago. If it weren't for the comment and the two questions asked by Brian Ratner in the previous episode in the comment section, I wouldn't have gone into this period with these examples that I gave, because it's a period that was very bad, not just for me, but for many people in the kibbutzim. And the way I overcame my own frustration with what was going on, because I didn't have the opportunity of leaving the kibbutz, even though when I returned from being an envoy of the kibbutzim to my kibbutz in 1986, my wife and I, we looked at kibbutz and we decided to leave. But sadly, there was a tragedy in my family. My wife was diagnosed with cancer and passed away, so I was stuck in kibbutz. If it weren't for the question asked by Brian Ratner, I would have preferred not to talk about this period now. And by the way I overcame my frustration in the second part of the 80s, the 90s, and the early parts of this 20th century was I wrote down my thoughts, which was a diary, which then became a book. Later on, I tried to publish it, but it was unsuccessful because I think I chose the wrong agent. The name of the book was, and still is, Kibbutz, a Ship of Fools, and in brackets, Trapped in Dystopia. One day I will publish this book, but what I have done now in this episode, I've just given just one or two hints about what was going on in kibbutzim to answer Brian's question, how, why kibbutzim ideologically lost their way and practically collapsed in terms of values and running the show. There were many, many, many more examples of the way kibbutzim had lost their way. Now, while people abroad and even foreign volunteers in the 80s and 90s who were actually living in kibbutzim believed that kibbutz was an ideal society, reality for members was anything but that. Not many people know that. As I said, this channel will have no sugar coating. I do not intend to say that the kibbutzim were always the best place to live, but until we found a solution to what had happened, the kibbutzim were on a path to destruction. And again, thank goodness, a few kibbutzim, maybe many kibbutzim, before my kibbutz, had already worked out a blueprint for reformation. And the kibbutzim today, the difference between kibbutzim then and now is the difference between day and night. So I want to finish up on a positive note. Kibbutzim today are a wonderful place to live, where people look after each other. There is a humane approach, and the kibbutzim have evolved into a new set of values. Kibbutzim are not socialist entities. Kibbutzim are most definitely, in my books at least, capitalist societies with socialistic values, whereby the community looks after you and you help others in the community to feel safe and healthy and the feeling of well-being. So I'll finish on that positive note and I'll wait for comments. I mean, I do expect, people will say, what? We didn't know this. We didn't know that that was happening behind the scenes. We were volunteers, part of the 300,000 volunteers who worked our guts off to support kibbutzim, and yet somehow, maybe we were being exploited. Well, you were not being exploited. I'll tell you why, very simply. Because even us members, people like me, or Pinchas Schwartz in the Ganibet, we were working hand in hand with the volunteers, and in the 70s and the 80s, there were many young kibbutzniks who did work in manual labor, in simple jobs, in boring jobs, in agriculture, or on the line in the industry. We, very simply, we didn't realize, because we were living what we thought was the dream, we didn't realize perhaps what was going on behind the scenes in certain areas such as managerial positions or overstaffing or things like that. I can just finish with one more example. I remember in the 1970s, I was working in the banana plantation, and in those days we had flood irrigation of the fields. And I had opened the sluices and I was sitting down on the ground. It was between the season. The season was October to March, basically. So it was in a hot summer's day and I was irrigating with flood irrigation. And I looked across the road because I was in the far fields, and I looked at Afikim with its large wood timber factory, Kelet Afikim. And I thought to myself, I just feel completely at peace with myself. I really feel calm. And I said to myself, I remember that feeling that particular afternoon. I said to myself, or maybe it was morning, it was so hot. I said to myself, why do I have to worry about money in the kibbutz? There are people in the office who are taking care of that. But I didn't know what the reality was and how, in fact, they were involved in different investment schemes. And, well, that's the way it was. So I'll leave you with that thought. Kibbutz today is not what it was. It's better. It's fantastic. Bye for now.